The Stanfords Travel Writers Festival welcomes back author and adventurer Levison Wood, and he talks to journalist, filmmaker and co-host of The First Mile, Ash Bhardwaj, about his book Encounters, A Photographic Journey. Bringing together 15 years of Levison's photography for the first time, they'll be telling the incredible stories of the world's most remote places and the people who live there. So please enjoy our final session of the day, Encounters with Levison Wood in conversation with Ash Bhardwaj.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining and welcome to this session of the Stanfords Travel Writing Festival. I'm Ash Bhardwaj. I am a travel journalist and a filmmaker. And today I have the great pleasure of interviewing my friend and colleague, a guy I've worked with quite a few times, Levison Wood. Now, Levison is known as a travel writer and a filmmaker. He's presented quite a few hit series now. The first one, of course, is Walking the Nile. He's been to the Himalayas. Most recently, he circumnavigated the Arabian Peninsula. And as well as that, he has written 9 books, or the 9th is coming out shortly. But the most recent one, and the one that we're going to be talking about today, is Encounters, which is all about Lev's photography, because Lev, as well as being a writer, a filmmaker and a presenter, is a very successful, published, and has had exhibitions as a professional photographer. So today we're going to be talking about Lev's photography through the book. So Lev, welcome. It's absolutely lovely to see you.
Thank you, Ash. No, it's always a pleasure. And thank you to everyone on the team for asking me back. And of course, it's a bit different this year being virtual, but hope you enjoy the chat and look forward to telling you a bit about my photography. Well, for me, Ash, photography had always just been a bit of a hobby, really, until I left the army. It was something I sort of played around with. Obviously, I traveled a lot, but I hadn't taken it seriously. And in fact, it was something that until I was sort of leaving the army, I'd almost avoided. I kind of had the mindset that to fully immerse yourself in a journey, you had to be in the moment and not too focused on documenting it. But of course, when I took up documentary making full time, I felt like it's something I should probably get the hang of and learn my craft. So back about 10 years ago, I bought my first proper camera and I set about sort of teaching myself. I never had any formal lessons or anything like that. I just started reading lots of photography magazines, actually. And bit by bit, I built up a portfolio of work. I set up a website and did everything from doing, taking friends' wedding photos, taking photos of people's babies and dogs and families, and slowly but surely, taught myself the art of photography. And it wasn't too long before I entered a few local competitions at home and won a couple of small prizes. And it was off the back of that, really, that I was then able to sell photos to magazines, newspapers, and then guidebooks. Really, the travel photography began because I was organizing expeditions and going away as a guide. I used that as an opportunity to get lots of photos and then sell them to Lonely Planet or whoever else it might be. So that was really where it all began. So very humble beginnings, but it was something that I felt would complement my work as a writer and a filmmaker. I remember back in 2010 when I bought my first camera, I thought the place that I can go and learn the best would be a country that's very colorful and very close to my own heart. I went to Mexico, having spent probably, it was about £3,000, which is all my money to my name, on a nice camera. I went to Mexico, and then literally on, I think, day 3 of the trip, it got stolen. It got nicked when I was traveling between 2 cities on one of those long distance buses, and I fell asleep, woke up, camera, everything gone, and it wasn't insured. So that was a real disaster as far as my photography career was going. But it was because of that I was introduced to a local Mexican photographer called Alberto, and he was a professional studio photographer. But he said, look, I'm embarrassed that you've had your equipment stolen in Mexico. So look, I'm going to lend you a camera and I'm going to teach you basic photography. So it was actually really, really good to have that opportunity to learn under somebody who had been practicing and studying for a long time. And it was that little moment of serendipity that enabled me to actually practice my skills and turn what could have been a big disaster into an opportunity. Alberto and I have stayed very good friends ever since, and in fact, my new book Encounters is dedicated to him for teaching me those basic skills. It's slowly transformed from being just a hobby into something that I really enjoyed, and I enjoyed learning about the craft itself. I enjoyed learning a bit about the technical side, so I just carried my camera everywhere that I went, because I was traveling to really interesting places, actually it wasn't that difficult to come away with some quite unique and interesting shots. I wasn't really doing much with them in those days. I was lucky if I could get them published, but usually it was for pennies, if not usually for free. But like anything, if you stick at it, you suddenly collect a portfolio, and sooner or later you can then start being taken seriously, and you can monetize it. And that's what I did very slowly. But it was really when I went away on Walking the Nile that it came in really, really useful, because I was desperate to document this journey in a way that would be appropriate to an expedition of that scale. And so I thought it'd be a shame not to have a good camera. So I did. I invested in a really good camera. I went away and came back with something ridiculous like 10,000 images. I slowly but surely built up this massive bank of images, and they of course appeared in my early books, Walking the Nile, Walking the Himalayas, and it was great because I developed my style. It's kind of, I hate to use the word, but it's kind of like a bit of a blend, a fusion between reportage photography and street photography. But of course, there's plenty of portraits and landscapes in there as well. So it's a real blend. What I'm trying to do with my images is capture a moment in time, capture the people and the essence of the journey, often in some of the most remote places on the planet.
And your new book, Encounters, I've been looking through it and it's beautiful. It's been wonderful having known you and your stories over the last few years, seeing some of the pictures come up, even from some of the locations that I joined you in every now and again. But even for places where I was, what's wonderful about seeing your photography in this book is I've seen those places and those stories in new ways. You've told a story in a different way from how you've told it in the book, from how it was told in the films. How long has this book been in the making? You talked about leaving the army in 2010. I've seen some pictures in here going all the way back to a trip to Siberia in 2012. So it's certainly been going for quite a while. So how long has it been in the making, and why did you choose the title Encounters to title this book?
Well, this really is a collection of images dating back over the last 10 years, ever since I left the army and started with some of those early expeditions to Siberia, to Afghanistan, to Madagascar. It spans that whole time. So this isn't just I'm not just regurgitating images from my televised expeditions like Walking the Nile, although there are a few images from there. What I've tried to do is demonstrate a collection of images from all around the world, with my encounters with different people and communities dating back the last decade. So for me, it's been a great opportunity to go back through lots of old hard disks and old laptops. I mean, I counted something like 50,000 images that I had to go through, which I then had to shortlist down to about 5,000 images, and then shortlist even more to the end product in this book, which is I think about 200 images. And that was a really tough process, because you can imagine the amount of images that are quite similar, but maybe they tell a slightly different story. So it was a lot of work, going back many, many years. And but it was a real sense of relief and joy when it finally was published last year, because to have a book like that, a really smart coffee table book, I feel very proud of that, because it's so different to my other work. And it's for me, it's a real treasure, because I can open that sometimes if I'm feeling a bit down, and it just brings back so many memories, so much nostalgia, and it's a real gift, actually. And it's certainly kept me in Christmas presents for all my family and friends.
And I certainly think for people that have followed your career for quite some time, seeing you from those early television programs on Walking the Nile, there'll be lots in here that they wouldn't have known about, and lots in here that shows the much broader remit of the work that you're interested in. I've just caught an image from your trip to South Sudan in 2012, when you went and found this enormous digger out in the middle of the desert. So there's a whole host of additional stories, but of course there's writing in here as well. And you have quite a lengthy introduction explaining photography and why you find it such an important craft, why it brings you a different type of joy to the writing and the filmmaking. But you've also broken the book up into 4 different chapters, and we're going to go through them by looking at an image from each of those chapters. And the first one is this fantastic image that we have from your first expedition, Walking the Nile. It's the Mandari cattle camp in South Sudan. So can you tell me a little bit about that, and about the chapter that it's in, and why you have chosen to arrange the photos in this way?
Well, that was one of the biggest challenges with this book, was trying to decide how to curate the images. What are the themes, and how I'm going to lay them out alongside each other. I didn't want to do just a simple chronology, nor did I want to do it as a geographical spread. I wanted to try and break it down into the themes that I have encountered the most throughout my travels. And I chose the word encounters for the title of the book, because for me, that's what my journeys have been all about. It's been a string of amazing encounters with people, with communities, with ideas and concepts, religions, philosophies on life. And so what this book does, I think, hopefully, is tell the stories of the people that I meet or have met along the way. And so when I tried to break it down, I thought, what are the main takeaways? What are the main themes that I have encountered? And the 4 themes that I've chosen for the book have been frontiers for the first one, conflict, heritage, and community. And the first image that we've got there, this Mandari cattle camp, really represents for me the idea of frontiers, because when I go to remote areas, some of these are in the borderlands of countries, some of these are in remote areas geographically or isolated because of their political situation. Frontier can mean lots of different things, but with this image in particular, South Sudan, it was at the time the world's newest country, just coming out of the back end of a civil war that had been raging for decades. Geographically, it's very isolated. It's a very, very rural and sparsely populated part of Africa that sits on the frontier between the Islamic north and the Christian and animist south. Physically, it's a frontier land as well. To the north, you've got the Sahara Desert, and to the south, you've got the start of sub-Saharan Africa. So it really is a frontier country. And when you go there, I've been to South Sudan 5 or 6 times, and it genuinely feels a bit like the Wild West. It's quite a lawless region. Everyone's carrying weapons. And it's deeply impoverished. It's a real tragedy in many ways. But also there are these little glimmers of hope, and this image is one of them. The Mandari are one of the main tribes in South Sudan, And whilst the main two tribes, the Dinka and the Nuer, have been fighting for each other for quite some time, the Mundari, as a sort of race of cattle herders, generally very peaceful, have been stuck in the middle of this conflict that's been raging for so long. And what they tend to do to avoid the conflicts is take their cows, which are ultimately their main source of wealth and income, and they go and hide in the vast swamp areas, the wetlands of the Sud Swamp. And you find these floating islands of papyrus, and on them are these amazing communities. And we went to visit the Mundari on one of these islands as part of my Walking the Nile expedition. And I stayed with them for a few days, and it was a real privilege and an honor to be amongst this community whose culture has endured for so long. And it's a very rudimentary culture in many ways. There's nothing by means of technology or anything really to suggest that, you know, they were in the 21st century. They live off their cows, they fish. I mean, it was amazing to see how they live almost solely off the land. And it was remarkable to go and spend time with them. I mean, their stoicism was incredible. I remember meeting one guy who was explaining that they can't swim in the river or get or sort of go for baths in the river because of the danger of crocodiles. So what they do to wash and how they brush their teeth is they basically use the back end of a cow. So you see these people having a shower from behind a cow and brushing their teeth using cow pee, which is a bizarre thing to think about. But it was a sense of wonder, really, to be amongst people who live in such a different way to my own. So yeah, I wanted to use this image really to represent what a frontier can mean, even in the modern world where we think we've kind of seen and done everything. Actually, there are still communities out there that live very different lives.
And of course, it's quite a seminal moment in the series of your Walking the Nile trip, that episode, seeing you there. I remember you wrestling with this absolute giant of a man who'd grown up on a diet of milk, but was nearly 7 feet tall, I believe. And you spending that time with those guys there, it was a wonderful example of how, even as you say, in places that have a very different type of society, apparently from the outside to what we think of, no technology to speak of, living on a floating island, but you're still able to create this bond with them. And the image itself is really quite remarkable. I'm looking at it now in front of me in the book, and it looks such a cliche, but it looks like a Renaissance painting because of this light coming out of the sky and illuminating in silhouettes the people and the smoke and dust coming up from the cattle camp. So would you like to talk a little about the light and the photograph itself, as well as the experience that you've had there? Because it's so easy to just think, we've all got iPhones, we can just snap a photograph when we go somewhere interesting, we presume that it's good. But I remember the attention you were putting to your photography when we were walking, for the elements I was with you on Walking the Nile, the time, the effort, the way you were thinking about composition, the way you were speaking to me about it. And years later on Walking the Americas, Alberto saying to me, he's got a very good eye. He's got a better eye than me. He notices these things, he spots them, and he really gets it. I remember Alberto, your mentor, telling me that. So do you just want to talk a little bit about the light in this photo, the Mundari cattle camp one?
Well, like I say, I spent 3 days with the Mundari on this island, and it was hard not to get a good photo, I have to say, because of the way people were dressed, because of the almost biblical aspect of the landscape, and like you say, the smoke rising from these dung fires, and the fact that everyone's basically naked and carrying spears. And it was a real joy to go and just snap away. And the people there loved being photographed. You know, people were queuing up to be photographed, and that always helps. And I've got lots of portraits from this place, and I've got lots of images of action of people having the cow showers and milking the cows and things like that. But this image in particular, I remember, because South Sudan, it rains a lot. It's a very green country. I mean, this was the sort of dry season, but when the light just shone through those clouds, breaking through, it was almost heavenly. And I knew I had to get an image that captured the scale. So I remember just taking a step back. I sort of ran away from this encampment and just took it on on a wide angle and just tried to capture the whole spirit of this place. And like you say, it's the silhouettes of people standing in the smoke. You can't identify anyone's faces or features. It just gives it a very almost surreal aspect. And like you say, it does feel a little bit like a painting. And I think this has been one of my most popular images that people want to buy, because whilst it is specific to South Sudan, it's something that, I don't know, you look at it and you could be almost anywhere. You could be in a story or a fairy tale. And that's what I love about this picture.
Yeah, I think you've really summarized it really neatly at the end there, why it appeals to so many people visually. It sort of resonates with something, this desire for mythology and this desire for fantasy that we all have. It really is a beautiful photo. But it couldn't be in greater contrast to the next photo we're going to talk about, which is one of the photos from the conflict section. I guess people tend to think of frontiers and conflict as things that go together, but it'd be great to hear you talk a bit about the notion of conflict. But this specific photo is very different. It's a photograph that you took in Homs in Syria during your circumnavigation of the Arabian Peninsula for the series Arabia. And this was at a time when Syria, you tell the story of it, Lev. You tell us the story of why this photograph matters so much, why it's so different. And it's of a man walking down the street, a street that appears to be empty of people other than him, of shattered buildings, of detritus and dust all over the place, and a bicycle with a few belongings in the back of it. Can you tell us a bit about it?
So I went to Syria as part of my Arabia journey back in 2018. And I went to the city of Homs. And now I'd been to Syria before the civil war, back in 2010, when it was very peaceful. And I traveled through Homs and Aleppo and Damascus then. And it stood out in my mind as one of my favorite places of all time. The people, the landscape, the sense of history. I've always had a real affinity to Arabia, to the Middle East. So to go back, in the middle of this civil war and see the destruction was truly heartbreaking. And particularly in Homs. I mean, I've been to Mosul and I've been to other destroyed cities, but Homs was on another level. I mean, the destruction, it looked like an atomic bomb had just been dropped on this city. Everything, for as far as the eye could see, completely destroyed. And walking through these streets where there was just, I suppose, the remnants of people's lives everywhere, just, dolls and toys and school books, it really brings it home that this is not some movie set. It's where people used to live. And it was really heartbreaking to see. But again, I was trying to find out, is there any hope left? And I bumped into this old man. He was pushing his little bicycle along. And he parked it up and he started like clambering over the rubble. And I took that shot as he was walking away from me. But I got chatting to him and he actually explained what he was doing. And he was the first person to return to that segment of the city in Homs, just a few weeks after it had been reclaimed by government troops from ISIS. And he told me his story about how so many members of his family had been killed, or who'd fled the country. His own children had fled to go and live in refugee camps or try to get to Europe, but he had stayed. He was determined to rebuild his home. And like I say, he was the first person to try and do that. And so I followed him. He invited me to come and see his little flat, his one-bedroom apartment in the city, which was basically just a pile of rubble. And I said, "You can't live here." And he said, I will come back. And there was no running water. There's nothing. nothing at all. But he was determined that one day he'd be able to live in his home. He wasn't giving up. And I think that spirit of resilience and stoicism really is representative of people in that country who've gone through so much. And I saw it time and again in Damascus, which is a beautiful city. It was very bizarre because the central part of Damascus had thankfully avoided much of the conflict. And so people were living normal lives there. But coffee shops and restaurants were open. So it was strange because you could be sitting there having a cup of coffee or indeed a glass of wine. You know, it's weird because in Damascus, there's nightclubs and bars. And yet just 3 miles away in some of the suburbs, you could hear the mortars landing and bombs going off. So a very surreal experience. But I remember walking around the citadel and the shopping area, and a lot of the old tourist shops were open, which I was quite shocked by because I didn't see any tourists. And I went and got chatting to an old carpet seller. And I said, I was just, chit-chatting away, and asked him if he'd sold many carpets. And he laughed at me and said, no, of course, I've not sold a single carpet in 7 years. Which begs the question, of course, why is the shops open? Why do they bother? And he looked at me as if I was asking a ridiculous question. He said, well, of course we keep the shops open because the tourists will come back. He said, maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, maybe not even for another 5 years, but one day they will come back and we must be open. And I think that sense of positivity and optimism against all odds is what has kept people going. So I was really taken aback by that, and that was very moving. So this image, for me, is very powerful because it represents hope amid such devastation, and conflict is something that I've encountered in most of my journeys, all of my journeys, in fact, going across the front lines, but nowhere more so than in the Middle East and on my Arabia journey. So there's a lot of images from the Middle East in this book, but not just there. The conflict, I've tried to show the sense of humanity, not just the negativity, but also a sense of optimism and the human stories, because that for me is the most important and the most interesting. It's not just showing bombed out buildings. It's about telling the stories of the people that have had to live through this and survive and ultimately try and thrive in a way that it's very hard for us in the West who've not lived through that to understand.
I think, again, the photographic skill that you use in order to tell the story through the picture. You have these leading lines of the pavement of the buildings with the man walking down the street in the center and the bicycle in the foreground it looks like a wide lens you've used to take this picture. And again, it's that case of having that background of skill that you've built up over the years, that you've developed over time, that means that when the moment arrives, you don't have to think about that. It just all happens. It allows you to tell the story and tell it in that deeper way. And looking through the conflict chapter, as you mentioned, you talked about lots of different things in there. One set of photographs I just briefly like to mention in this chapter are the photographs from poaching. So you've got some photographs. I think they're from Uganda, the ones of the elephant tusks. No, you've got some from Virunga and also some from Botswana. And your previous book, of course, was Walking with Giants. The Last Giants, and the series Walking with Giants. And conservation and protection of biodiversity has always been a big part of your work. And I think you've done a really good job of highlighting how it actually drives conflict. So it's great to see it in this conflict chapter. Do you want to talk a little bit about could you just tell me a little bit about how you have chosen to put that in here and how that's affected your work?
Yeah, so conflict, of course, can come in many forms. And this chapter covers conflicts ranging from the ganglands of Central and South America to the war zones of the Middle East, but also some of the more forgotten wars like Nagorno-Karabakh on the fringes of Europe, or indeed, some of the armed struggles that are going on across Asia, but this one in particular in Central and East Africa, the war against poaching, the war to save the wildlife is something that you wouldn't necessarily think about as a conflict zone, but it is for the rangers who are doing this job day in, day out. And I've seen it myself, like you say, in the Congo. and in Botswana, where you have these people who are often civilians. They're not necessarily military trained. They're given a uniform, given a weapon, and then told to go and protect the elephants, often against very determined, hardened criminals armed with high-tech weapons and a lot of money, who are going in there to kill wildlife. And these are warriors. They have to fight, and there's often pretty big battles going on. And I've spent a bit of time with these rangers on patrol, collecting snares, collecting traps, and it's a real fight. And so I wanted to include this in the conflict chapter to demonstrate that this asymmetric warfare is going on, and it's something that we can't ignore. And I think it's a very important story to tell.
Another thing you do cover quite movingly in this chapter is the legacy of war, and the photographs that really stand out to me in that are the ones of the Democratic Republic of Congo, when you went out with UNICEF.
Yeah, I mean, I was very fortunate to go out to DRC in October 2019 with UNICEF, for who I'm a sort of a supporter, and they invited me to go and see the work that they're doing to rehabilitate former child soldiers. And some of these kids, and they are kids, are 10, 11, 12 years old, who have been forced into this conflict, often by being kidnapped and forced to fight, often against their own families. Very, very tragic stories. But the great work being done by UNICEF and other charities is to try and support them to reintegrate into society. And that's what I wanted to show with these images, is how that is being done, and show that the face of war isn't always a grizzled veteran. Often it's by some of the most vulnerable people in society. And that legacy of war and that tragedy is something that I want to show, shine a light on, that it's not as simple or as black and white as we often think.
Because they were children, you couldn't show their faces. So you've used different ways to tell the story of how stories that affected that individual, not just all of them being in silhouette. But it's really quite moving. It's not worth me talking through the images themselves, but it's a part of the book that really I found very powerful. And the next chapter that we're going to come onto is heritage. And the photograph that you've used, that we're going to talk about today, is this beautiful silhouette from the Dhofar Ridge in Oman, where I was actually with you again during your circumnavigation of Arabia. And it's a Jabali camel herder with his camel. Tell us a bit about this picture, Liv.
I love this image because for me, that trek over the Dhofar Ridge in Oman was just one of the most spectacular walks I've ever done. And you were there, Ash. It was just beautiful, wasn't it? I mean, going through these ancient forests of frankincense and climbing up these caves. And I mean, it's like the Grand Canyon when you're sort of climbing up there. It's absolutely remarkable. For me, it was a very special part of that journey. It was a side of Arabia that I just wasn't prepared for. It just blew me away visually. And to be in the company of these Jabali people, these mountain men, very hardened, grisly men who had spent their lives growing up in caves with their camels. And the camels there were amazing. They weren't normal desert camels that sort of plod along. These camels were really hardcore cliff climbers. And it was this guy in the image. He was the sort of one of the lead guides. He was only a young man, but you can see the silhouette there. And in his hand is a sword. This guy carried a broadsword with him. And the image, it looks almost sort of medieval, doesn't it? And it's sort of conjures up these 1001 nights. It's quite a romantic image of Arabia, but the story behind the sword is somewhat grisly. He carries it because if a camel slips and breaks its neck, he has to kill the camel with the sword by basically slitting its throat. So I wanted to capture that rawness of the journey, but in a really romanticized and stylized image there. So it's kind of a picture postcard image in some ways, but the reality behind it was quite raw and authentic. And the view of the cliffs going back for as far as the eye can see just conjures up so many ideas of vastness, and the scale of it was just really beautiful.
It was a truly amazing place to be, and one of the great things that your work does, not just in the photography, but also the work that you do through your books and television, is to show that there are still places of wonder and cultural interest in the world. There's a lot of lazy commentary around about how through globalization the world is all the same, that there's no wonder, there's no adventure left to be had. But you've shown that in one of the more touristically developed nations of the Middle East, Oman, that there is still these amazing regions that you can go and visit and spend time with people and really encounter a very different heritage. Within other parts of this chapter, you've visited Kenya and Japan, again places where the lazy cliche is that the heritage is being wiped out by globalization and development. But you show throughout this chapter that it's possible to find these things just by doing a bit of work and, importantly, engaging with people.
Yeah, this chapter really is all about, for me, it's all about contrasts, and it's often showing the juxtaposition of old versus new. And in places like Japan, some of my images there show, these amazing geisha ladies crossing a road with the sort of neon lights of modern Japan, or indeed in somewhere like Saudi Arabia, where you see these warriors in traditional costume, but then in one hand he's got his dagger, and the other hand he's got a mobile phone, and it's things like that it shows the heritage, but doesn't sugarcoat it. What I want to do is demonstrate how often culture and legacy can thrive even within the sort of new modernity that we live in, and that's what this chapter is about. It's about showing change. It's showing how sometimes cultures will change, but parts of it will and parts of it won't, and hopefully in doing so it can regenerate that spark of wanderlust within us all, and show that there's still plenty of interesting things out there to discover.
It's a really good chapter to demonstrate the different types of photography you do. I mean, you spoke earlier about your style and reportage. Obviously in this chapter, and again in the chapter I'm about to come to, you've asked people to stand for a photograph, but you're not someone that's producing photo shoots. He talks about these juxtapositions that you see in Japan, that you see in Saudi Arabia, and you spot something happening and you grab the photograph rather than overly producing the image. And some of them are of people and some of them are of landscapes and people in landscapes. But I think that ability to just seize the moment and document it well is something you do very well. And a great example of that is the final photograph we're going to talk about, which is this absolutely striking young lady, striking girl, Eloisa in Brazil, who has the most remarkable eyes and is in what appears to be a traditional outfit. Can you tell us a bit more about it? Sorry, Eloisa, not Eloisa. Eloisa.
So the final chapter, community, the idea was to show how, regardless of which part of the world you're from, or which culture, or which religion, or anything like that, that people are people, and that sense of community is central to what unites us, and to showcase that there are far more things that do unite us than divide us. And I think that's a particularly important message in today's polarized world. And this image of Eloisa, she was a young girl from the Desana tribe in Brazil, right in the heart of the Amazon, not far away from the city of Manaus, which is sort of quite a big industrial city on the river, on the Amazon River itself. But you don't have to go far to meet the indigenous communities. So a couple of hours upstream, there was what you'd expect, a sort of typical thatched hut community. And the people there, sometimes would wear traditional costumes, sometimes they wouldn't, and just depended. And I didn't want to shy away from that. I didn't want to sort of, again, sugarcoat this idea that, you don't have to go far before you see people dressed in feathers and things, because a lot of the time they will only put the feathers on if a tourist comes. And I talk about that in the book, actually. But they will wear them for certain religious ceremonies and so on. But what for me was more important wasn't the outfit or the clothing that this girl was wearing. It's what she represented, because whilst she was of an indigenous community, as you can see by her eyes, very striking eyes, she's got quite a European face. When I asked her mother if I could take this young girl's photograph, she was saying, of course, she's the most beautiful girl in the village. Why wouldn't you take her photograph? And I asked, I said, what's the sort of heritage? And she said, well, the white man came here some time ago and left his genes behind. So Brazil's a good example of a real fusion of different cultures. It's a real melting pot of different ethnicities. And it was amazing, because you don't really see, well, certainly I didn't when I was there, you don't really encounter racism, because you see people of every ethnicity, every race, and there's no real barriers to that. You'll see couples of all different backgrounds together, and it's a really heartwarming thing to see, actually. And even in the indigenous communities, it was something they were very proud of. She said, yeah, she's a blend. And what she represented, this young girl, Eloisa, was that sense of unified humanity and the fact we're all human beings. And that's what I wanted to show.
Can you talk a bit about some of the other photographs that you've got in this? There's a great one of a baby being weighed in. Is it Botswana? It's I'm trying to find out. DRC again, on that same trip from UNICEF, and a couple of fishermen on Lake Choga. So you've got quite a lot of different photographs that you use to talk about community in this. So you've talked a bit about sort of the wider human community of us all being part of the human race, but you've also shown some more specific things from different communities of things that are just people going around their normal business.
And that's it. Most of the time I'm not seeking anything other than the norm, really. I'm trying to show normal life in cultures that are different to our own, and how people do things similarly and how people do things differently. And the one of the baby being weighed is it's these two sort of community nurses weighing a baby. Normally, if you were to take a baby to be weighed in the West, I'm sure it would be done according to the highest health and safety standards. Here, they literally have one of those sort of one of those scales that you put up on a hook, and they just like basically hook the baby on a tree to weigh the little baby. And it was done very lovingly and very gently. But gosh, I think there'd be a lot of mothers back home that would be tearing their hair out if they saw that. But equally, people cooking, people just going out shopping, people having an ice cream. It's kind of like normal life, but not as we know it.
And it's great to see all these different photos alongside each other as the book progresses, and seeing the dates in it reminds us again of just how long you've been doing this. So photography has always been this thing that's gone in your background, and really it was what you set out to do as your career, really, before the writing came along and before the presenting came along. So it's ironic that it's taken so long for you to eventually have the photography book out, but I think it's a really good illustration of that aphorism. It takes 10 years to become an overnight success, of all the work that you put in order to get up to this point. I remember before you set out on walking the Nile, when you decided to invest the last bit of your savings, because almost all of the money had gone into funding the trip and getting yourself out there in the first place. And then the last bit you had, which you'd put aside quite some time before and really saved up for, was to get a really good camera. And I think there's certainly something to be said of that commitment of, this is what I'm going to do, and in order to prove to myself and make sure I really take it serious, I'm going to get this camera. And you only took one lens with you, didn't you?
So it was funny, because I remember when I first left the army and I was like going camera shopping. I was in New York and I went into this camera shop and saw the most beautiful camera I'd ever seen, a Leica camera. an old M series one, and it looks just like a really sturdy old-fashioned film camera, but this was the first iteration of the digital ones. And I wanted it, but then I saw the price tag. It was, I won't say how much it cost, so I couldn't afford it. So I got a much cheaper one, and that's what I practiced on. And then, like I said before, it got stolen in Mexico. So before the Nile, I remember thinking, you know what, I'm going to go and ask Leica if they will sponsor my trip, or at least give me a free camera. So I walked in and introduced myself, and they basically told me to disappear, not a chance. So I said, fine, I'm just going to basically, like you say, commit to this. I went and bought myself a Leica camera using every penny of my overdraft. And off I went to walk the Nile, took lots of photographs, came back. And then when it went on television, of course, Leica got back in touch and said, okay, you've proved to us your commitment. Now we'll sponsor you. So I've been a very proud Leica ambassador ever since for the last 7 years now. And I'm very, very lucky to be able to road test their equipment. And I've taken Leica cameras with me on all my expeditions since then. And I've probably broken quite a few in the process. So I wonder if they're regretting that decision. But yeah, no, it's great. You know, now to finally, after all these years, not shy away from the term professional photographer, because there's often a bit of sort of fear about, oh, I'm a professional photographer, I need to know everything about photography. But actually now, when I sort of see the work, actually, it's like I say, this is 10 years work. It's a long time to be doing something. But I'd like to think now, whether or not I'm technically any good is by the by. I'm very happy with the work that I've produced, and I just hope that other people will find some enjoyment from it.
Yeah, I've always found it very inspiring as something to take into other fields as well. You're not someone who is a Photoshop fanatic. I think you use Lightroom as the only thing you ever use for doing a bit of adjusting on your photos. You're not someone that spends hours and hours doing that digital post-production. For you, it's very much about the story that you're finding within it and getting the right photo in the first place rather than trying to mess around with it afterwards. You're also not a kit monkey. You're not obsessed with knowing all of the details of the way the lens was ground or anything like that. You focused on getting the skill right and doing lots of practice. And I think that's really quite inspirational for anybody who's trying to get into anything, because there's so much when you're trying to start a new skill or develop a skill or an interest, to spend the money, to do all the courses. And you've shown that all you need to do is have enough kit to practice and enough kit to develop that skill, an interest and a passion, and then just go out and do lots of it. And maybe 10 or 11 years down the line, other people will also be having a professional photography book. But for those people that are budding photographers, whether those are people who are at the start of their career to become a professional, or just someone who's interested in doing it on holiday or to support other parts of their work that they're already up to, what would you say are the simple philosophies that you've learned about travel, or the tips that you would have for any budding photographer?
I think you summed it up very nicely there. For me, it's not about the kit or the equipment or which lens you shot it on. To be honest, that doesn't really interest me as much as the end product, about getting a really powerful, striking image that tells a story. And that's what my images hopefully do. They're not just pretty pictures about landscapes. The subject matter is telling somebody's story in their own environment, and often it's the journey to get there, because an image isn't just that digital file. It's the months of preparation and planning and cost that goes into the journey to get to a specific place. So it's all well and good being a good technical photographer, but you've got to put yourself in the right place at the right time to get those good images. So for me, it's far more about being a good traveler first and foremost, because it's honing the communication skills and the sort of diplomacy skills to enable me to convince somebody to let me take their picture in the first place, and then that's far more important than which lens you shot it on.
And we touched on earlier about those photographs I've seen from your early days around London. Do you still spend time now going around the UK? Obviously, we've had a year where travel has been limited. Are you still taking photographs around London? Are you still keeping your eye in, doing those sorts of things?
Yeah, I take my camera wherever I can. I love just taking photos for the sake of it. Even if it doesn't have a specific publication in mind, I love taking photos of the UK or anywhere else. So you've got to keep the joy, and it's one thing being sent on assignment or going away to see it as a job, but I just like the process of creativity and actually creating something that is beautiful and interesting. And for me, it's not always about the sort of the it's not about just having a book or anything like that. It's about it's sometimes just for me, and some of these images will never see the light of day, but I quite like that.
And now that you are allowed to call yourself a professional photographer, what are the things that has opened up to you that maybe you weren't doing before? You talked about the UNICEF project. Are there any other projects that you've done as a photographer and not just as part of your work as a explorer and travel writer and filmmaker?
Yeah, I mean, the photography has opened up a number of things. I mean, I will often just go out and do a lot of photography for, like you say, charities. I mean, I really love working with charities like UNICEF, where I get to go and hopefully do something good with my photography. I've done a lot with conservation charities across Africa. I work with the Tusk Trust, and I've gone out to photograph some of their projects, everything from elephants in Botswana and Kenya to gorillas in Uganda. And then I've done bits with the military as well. And I've been fortunate enough to go out and photograph, the troops in Croatia or Japan and different places. So it's been a really diverse photography career over the last 10 years. Hopefully it won't take me another 10 years to build up enough photographs to publish another book. But like I say, for me, first and foremost, it's been a real joy. It's been a hobby that I've never lost the love for, probably because it's not something I've done as my first and foremost job, really. And by having it as my sort of second or third project, it's been something that I've really enjoyed, just for fun.
Well, until we have another 10 years of photographs to turn into a second book, I think this is a wonderful document and a wonderful record of your journey so far and your photography so far. So Encounters is out now. Of course, the best place to get it is Stanfords, the home of travel writing and the home of travel books. And it's been a real pleasure to talk to you, Lev, about the journey you've been on. I knew some of these stories and I knew elements of how you got through to where you are now in your photography, but it's been great for you to talk about it so honestly and openly and share some stories we've never seen before. And it's been such a pleasure for me as a friend of yours to read this book and see and learn so much more about these trips and see these stories in an entirely different way. So Encounters is out now, and thanks so much for your time there. Thanks for talking to me today.
Thank you, Ash. It's been a real privilege and really good fun as ever. Thank you, mate.
Absolutely superb. A great final session there. If you were inspired by our last session, do click over to the Stanfords virtual stand, where you can buy a signed copy of Levison's excellent book, Encounters. Oh, and of course, explore all the other wonderful things they have going on. Do remember that Stanfords Travel Writers Festival continues on the Stanfords website until the 4th of February, with lots of incredible interviews, so don't miss out.
For 7 years now, the Stanfords Travel Writers Festival has been proud to be a part of Destinations, bringing inspirational talks from explorers, adventurers, historians, novelists, TV personalities, and many more of the very best travel authors. To delve into our treasure trove of travel books, maps, the greatest selection of globes in the world, and the rest of our 24-event festival lineup, head to stanfords.co.uk, and we'll see you right here in your very own front row for the Stanfords Travel Writers Festival 2021.